Topic 1. Language and communication. Language. Functions. The Communicative Competence. ITS. Components. Introduction. In current approaches of FLT, foreign language teaching, a strong importance is given to the role of communication as the natural means of learning and acquiring a second language. It is important to distinguish between learning and acquisitions, that is, between the process through which linguistic mechanisms of a given language are studied and reproduced with the help of grammatical rules and exercises, on one hand, and on the other, the process of assumption and spontaneous use of that language. Thus, it is necessary not only mastering the structure of a second language, linguistic or systemic competence, but also using that linguistic system efficiently enough in the appropriate context, communicative competence. Nowadays, we call communicative competence to the mastering of grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation together with an appropriate use of the foreign language, depending on the situation and context. Language and communication. Due to the fact that we live in community, we communicate and have contacts with our surrounding beings and objects. In everyday life, people spend a lot of time issuing and receiving messages: a look, a gesture, the price of an item, the traffic signs, a theater play or a movie, or the mass media, press, radio, television, are all communication acts in which language plays an important role as a communication instrument. From a child's cry to the most perfect symphony, from a meaningless greeting as high to the most complex philosophical essay, the communication possibilities range in amount and grade. They are communication at different levels with different aims, but they are all communication and language. But what is communication? Communication, in its broadest sense, is the transmission of information or the contact between two entities. In this sense, information is that part of communication which adds to every relating process an informative element: the message. The message is a substance with a given form, a form that can be translated into acoustic vibrations, spoken message, electrical impulses, telephone message, graphical and visual forms, written message. According to Jacobson's model of communication, this message is sent by a source or an addresser to a receiver or addressee. To be operative, the message requires a context referred to referent in another nomenclature, seizable by the addressee and either verbal or capable of being verbalized, a code fully or at least partially common to the addresser and addressee, in other words, to the encoder and decoder of the message, and finally a contact, a physical channel and psychological connection between the addresser and their addressees, enabling them to enter and stay in communication. Alternative. You can also write in this first part about the process and the elements of communication. Topic 2. 2. Functions of language. The word functionality refers to the functions of a language, which define the roles played by each of the elements involved in the communication act. But functionality also implies the communicative functions which are applied to the second language teaching process. Thus, if we observe the different situations in which language is used, we can see that its final objective is to communicate ideas. This referential or prepositional function is found in a teacher's explanation in class, in a discussion around a polemic matter, or a letter sent to a friend. However, this is not the only function, because we can also find in human behavior some other different situations. Greetings among people who do not know one another, for instance, good morning, references about the weather, such as, awful weather, isn't it? And so on, do not give any kind of information. Our intention is to break the ice with the other person. These behaviors were studied by Malinowski, who called them phatic function or communion, based on the human need to get closer to unknown people. C. The passionate singings of the crowd in a concert, their interjections in a political meeting, or the unique answer of the people in the mass, they are all expressions of emotional feelings, without transmission of any ideas to a particular addressee. The language used in these cases is the expression of identity by the members of a group. The function assigned here is centered on the sender and is called expressive. Two main phenomena affect this function: the use of curse or swear words and of non-standard English varieties as a mechanism of cohesion in a group of people, together with their separation from other groups. D. In literature and poetry, Many circumstances occur which make us think of a sort of language function which does not correspond to the basic communicative scheme. What is found here is the aesthetic effect. This function is called poetic. Crosswords, linguistic explanations, words games, tongue twisters, etc., show the existence of a ludic function whose aim is to entertain or enjoy. This is the metalinguistic function. On the other hand, Halliday establishes only 3 functions of language. A. The ideational function. It represents the speaker's meaning potential as an observer. It is what he calls language as about something. B. The interpersonal function. It represents the speaker's meaning potential as an intruder. It is language as doing something. C. The textual function. It represents the speaker's text-forming potential. It expresses the relation of the language to its environment. Halliday says that it is only in combination with textual meanings that ideational and interpersonal meanings are actualized. These 3 functional components of the semantic system are reflected in the lexicogrammatical system in the form of discrete networks of options. These network of options are transitivity and transformations as part of the ideational function. Related to the interpersonal function, we find mood and modality. The third function, thus the textual one, is related to theme and cohesion. It is also Halliday who talks about situational elements. These are field, tenor, and mode, and all of them represent the semiotic structure of a situation type. Firstly, the field is the social action in which the text is embedded, and also the subject matter. Secondly, the tenor is the set of role relationships among participants, plus the levels of formality. Finally, the mode is related to the channel selected, thus, whether the text is written or not. Halliday states in its simplest term the way in which speakers make predictions about the meanings that are to be exchanged. Imagine that you come in, as we often do in real life, to a situation that is already going on. It does not matter what it is. It could be just a group of people engaged in any kind of activity. You, as an individual, come into this group from outside. Very quickly, you are able to take part in the interaction. How do you do this? You do, Halliday suggests, by constructing in your mind a model of the context of situation, and you do so in something like these terms. You assign to it a field. Noting what is going on, the field is expressed through the experiential function in the semantics. You assign to a tenor recognizing the personal relationships involved. The tenor is expressed through the interpersonal function in the semantics, and you assign to it a mode, which is expressed through the textual function in the semantics, seeing what is being achieved by means of language. You make predictions about the kinds of meaning that are likely to be foreground in that particular situation. So you come with your mind alert, with certain aspects of your language ready foreground, ready to be accessed, as it were, for taking part in this interaction. Something like this, we think, must be going on. Otherwise, it would be impossible to explain how it is that in real life we do so readily join in and take part in a situation that previously we knew nothing about. 3. A theoretical framework of communicative competence. Generally speaking, we can say that the communicative competence is a person's ability to appropriately behave in a specific speech community. This implies respecting a set of rules that include from grammatical and other linguistic levels rules, lexical, phonetical, and semantic, to the rules of the use of language related with the socio-historical and cultural context in which communication takes place. The European Framework of Reference for Languages states that the language communicative competence includes linguistic, socio-linguistic, and pragmatic competences. These competences are as well integrated in the following individual general competences: to know, general knowledge about the world, the socio-cultural knowledge, intercultural awareness, to know how to do things, skills, and abilities, to know to be the existential competence related to the activities, motivations, values, beliefs, and to know to learn. In recent years, the strategic and the psycho-emotional competences have also been added. Here, we will analyze the approaches to the concept made by different authors, from Noam Chomsky, the pioneer and father of the distinction competence/performance, to Delheims, who is the one who expanded Chomsky's somewhat restricted view of competence to include the fundamental dimension of contextual appropriateness and culture. leading into the ultimate conception officially adopted by the Spanish education authorities in relation to the learning of foreign languages. A. Chomsky's theory. One of the topics most central to psycholinguistic research is the acquisition of language by children. The term acquisition is preferred to learning because learning tends to be used by psychologists in a narrowly technical sense, and many psycholinguists believe that no psychological theory of learning, as currently formulated, is capable of accounting for the process whereby children, in a relatively short time, come to achieve a fluent control of their native language. Since the beginning of the 1960s, research on language acquisition has been strongly influenced by Chomsky's theory of generative grammar, and the main problem to which it has addressed itself has been how it is possible for young children to infer the grammatical rules underlying the speech they hear, and then to use these rules for the construction of utterances that they have never heard before. It is Chomsky's conviction, shared by a number of psycholinguists, that children are born with knowledge of the formal principles that determine the grammatical structure of all languages, and that it is this innate knowledge that explains the success and speed of language acquisition. Others have argued that it is not grammatical competence as such that is innate, but more general cognitive principles, and that the application of these to language utterances in particular situations ultimately yields grammatical competence. Traditional approaches to foreign language teaching describe the proficiency of a learner in terms of his mastery of the linguistic system. One of the first people to analyze in depth the characteristics of language as a system was Saussure, with the distinction between langue and parole. In this sense, Chomsky's theory of competence and performance is similar to Saussure's dichotomy. Language is the faculty of speech present in all normal human beings due to heredity, our ability to talk to each other. This faculty is composed of two aspects: langue, the language system, and parole, the act of speaking. The former is the totality of a language, which we could in theory discover by examining the memories of all the language users, that is, the sum of word images stored in the mind of individuals. Parole is the actual, concrete act of speaking on the part of a person, a dynamic, social activity in a particular time and place. The distinction made by Chomsky was between competence, a speaker's intuitive knowledge of the rules of his native language, and performance, what he actually produces by applying these rules. Chomsky's view of what it means to know a language is reflected in his distinction between linguistic competence and linguistic performance. In Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, 1965, he writes, "Linguistic theory is concerned primarily with an ideal speaker-listener in a completely homogeneous speech community who knows its language perfectly and is unaffected by such grammatically irrelevant conditions as memory limitations, distractions, shifts of attention and interest, and errors, random or characteristic, in applying his knowledge of the language in actual performance." The perfect knowledge referred to here is the mastery of the abstract system of rules by which a person is able to understand and produce any and all of the well-formed sentences of his language, i.e., his linguistic competence. This linguistic competence was, therefore, a subconscious or tacit knowledge of the grammar rules of a language which allows us to make sentences. The actual use of language, affected by what he terms grammatically irrelevant conditions and identified with the criterion of acceptability, not grammaticality, is the domain of linguistic performance. Thus, linguistic performance is the use of language in concrete situations. One of the major problems that arise from the foregoing is Chomsky's line of demarcation between competence and performance. Linguistic competence must cover not only the ability to repeat or understand already heard sentences, but also the ability to produce and understand new utterances. Because of this, we cannot say that language is a set, no matter how big, of utterances that have actually occurred. Any utterance will not qualify as a sentence in competence. Chomsky's claim was that linguistic competence provides an object of study and that the linguist should be initially concerned with it. Linguistic performance is thus evicted from the domain of linguistic, but only initially. Chomsky sees the importance of studying linguistic performance, but he finds it necessary to know about the form and structure of language as represented by linguistic competence first. B. Criticism to Chomsky's approach. It can be argued that Chomsky described as matters of performance a number of factors that should be handled in terms of competence. However, other linguists such as Hymes, Campbell, Wales, and Widdowson, and others reject his restricted view of competence. In fact, Hymes points out that Chomsky's category of competence provides no place for competency for language use, neither does his category of performance, despite his equating language use with performance. This omits almost everything of sociocultural significance, concerning itself with psychological constraints to do with memory and perception, etc., rather than with social interaction. Also, Chomsky's notion of performance seems confused between actual performance and underlying rules of performance, e.g., stylistic rules of performance, which Hymes considers part of underlying competence. Hymes' elements of communicative competence are 1. Systematic potential. It means that the native speaker has a system that has potential for creating a lot of language. This is similar to Chomsky's linguistic competence. We study if an utterance is possible according to the forms of expression available. 2. Appropriacy, which means that the native speaker knows what language is appropriate in a given situation. An utterance will be appropriate in relation to a context. 3. Occurrence, which means that the native speaker knows how often something is said in the language and act accordingly. This means that an utterance should not only be possible from a grammatical point of view, it should also be actually performed. 4. Feasibility, which means that the native speaker knows whether something is possible in the language. Even if there is no rule, systematic potential, to ban 20 adjective prehead constructions, we know that these constructions are not possible in the language. Campbell and Wales point out that Chomsky's competence omits by far the most important linguistic ability to produce or understand utterances which are not so much grammatical but, more important, appropriate to the context in which they are made, and they continue, by context we mean both the situational and verbal context of utterances. Appropriateness. Thus, it can be seen that the notion of competence must be enlarged to include contextual as empirical evidence from sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics, neurolinguistics, and any other relevant discipline, indicates that the constraints they provide can be formalized as rules. One should extend or recast the concept of competence as performance-constrained competence, to include them to cover all rule-governed language behavior. Finally, Widdowson disagrees with Chomsky's view by saying that the restriction of competence to perfect knowledge in a homogeneous speech community independent of sociocultural features is inadequate to account for language in use, for language as communication. 4. A practical analysis of the communicative competence. A. Communicative learning/acquisition competence in second language. Once we have considered communicative competence from a theoretical point of view, we have to focus our attention on the practical side of the question, that is, the foreign language learner and the specification of his/her desirable proficiency in that language. Therefore, before moving on to deal with the 4 different dimensions constituting communicative competence, we must lay the foundations for such a model. We will describe the concepts we must bear in mind to teach a second language, without forgetting about the social context where the potential language learner will have to move. The 3 key components of this ideological framework are society, meaning, and discourse, which are closely interlocked. 1. Society. When learning or teaching a language, we cannot forget that we are supposed to interact with other speakers in order to practice the language. However, as Hymes points out, one is not dealing with perfect competence in a homogeneous speech community. Consequently, before deciding what we are going to teach our pupils, we will have to look around ourselves and observe the learner's social context. Thus, we will carry out a need analysis, that is, what they need their English for, what the relationships between them and their interlocutors are. It follows that the specification of communication needs is prior to the selection of speech functions or communicative acts to be taught. In addition, apart from his knowledge about the target language, the learner will have to observe the maxim of contextual appropriateness, that set of rules of language use in accordance with the actual social context, what, when, and how to say, as there are rules of use, without which the rules of grammar would be useless. 2. Meaning. Stemming from the concept of meaning potential. Halliday develops his functional approach to language, stating that language functions are not just the different things we can do with language, but a fundamental tenet to develop its semantic system. If we can translate options in behavior, what we can do, into options in linguistic form, what we can say, this is just because there are several semantic options, language functions, available to the speakers of a particular speech community. The important thing is that we have to approach language from the standpoint of meaning. And this is precisely the core of a communicative approach to language teaching. That is, instead of starting from the linguistic forms themselves, grammatical syllabus, or sequencing them according to an analysis of situational needs, situational syllabus, it is not always possible to relate all of a person's language needs to a particular situation. We must start from the notional categories, functional notional syllabus, which a learner needs to handle, the things we use language for, and then select from the set of linguistic forms those appropriate to his, her level and needs. This is clearly much more relevant to the development of the learner's communicative competence. 3. Discourse. With discourse, we are referring to that level between grammar and non-linguistic organization where we find the so-called speech acts, communicative units at the level of discourse, both written and spoken. This mediates immediately between the usual levels of grammar and the rest of a speech event or situation in the sense that it implicates both linguistic form and social norms. So, again, we find ourselves embedded in the very social milieu. Speech acts involve how we do things, communicative acts, with words for interaction, pragmatic level. All this will mean knowing the rhetorical rules of use governing such acts, the interpretative strategies of the language user, strategic competence and negotiation of meaning, and the contextual meaning of an utterance, the value derived from its positional significance in the discourse. To sum up all these ideas, the implications for our model include selecting communicative units, such as speech functions or rhetorical acts, rather than grammatical elements, in the specification of a syllabus. Rhetorical rules and contextual meaning are as important as grammatical rules and referential meaning, so they should be taught as appropriate to the required acts and functions. A concern with communicative competence indicates the need for redefining the dimensions of syllabus specification to take account of the communicative value of discourse level units. B. Components of communicative competence. 1. Grammatical competence. Grammatical competence refers to what Chomsky calls linguistic competence and what Himes intends by what is formally possible. This type of competence remains concerned with mastery of the language code itself. It includes features and rules of the language such as vocabulary, word formation, sentence formation, pronunciation, spelling, and linguistic semantic. Vocabulary includes common vocabulary related to topics selected according to analysis of learners' communicative needs and interests, the meaning of idioms in context, and basic meaning of other vocabulary items in context, that is, grammatical function words such as prepositions and articles. With word formation, we have inflection and agreement in context, which refer to concordance of number and gender, derivation of new words, and variation at words' boundaries in context. Related to pronunciation, we point out pronunciation of lexical items in connected speech. Such competence focuses directly on the knowledge and skill required to understand and express accurately the literal meaning of utterances. As such, grammatical competence will be an important concern for any second language program. 2. Socio-linguistic competence. It refers to an understanding of the social context in which communication takes place. This competence addresses the extent to which utterances are produced and understood appropriately. In different sociolinguistic contexts, depending on contextual factors such as status of participants, purposes of interaction, and norms or convention of interaction. Appropriateness of utterances refers to appropriateness of meaning. In other words, the extent to which particular communicative functions are given, e.g., commanding, complaining, and inviting, attitudes, including politeness and formality, and the ideas which are judged to be proper in a given situation. There is a tendency in many second language programs to treat sociolinguistic competence as less important than grammatical competence. This tendency seems odd for two reasons. First, It gives the impression that grammatical correctness of utterances is more important than appropriateness of utterances in actual communication, an impression that is challenged by data from first language use and second language use. Second, this tendency ignores the fact that sociolinguistic competence is crucial in interpreting utterances for their social meaning. For example, when interpreting communicative function and attitude, when this is not clear from the literal meaning of utterances or from nonverbal cues, we have to take into account social appropriateness rules and linguistic realization rules. The former deal with whether or not a given function would normally be conveyed at all, and, if so, with how much directness, and the latter involve a number of considerations, such as the frequency with which a given grammatical form is used to convey a given function, the number and structural range of forms associated with each function, the generality of forms across functions and situations, and the means of modulating the attitudinal tone of a given function. Some authors add another subcompetence within the communicative competence, the socio-cultural competence, which refers to the learner's knowledge of the cultural aspects of the target language-speaking countries. According to Canale and Swaim, this subcompetence is included within the socio-linguistic competence. 3. Discourse competence, coherence and cohesion. Discourse competence refers to the interpretation of individual message elements in terms of their interconnectedness and how meaning is represented in relationship to the entire discourse or text. Therefore, it implies the combination of grammatical forms and meanings, and includes the knowledge and use of common oral and written genres, that is, the different types of text. That leads us to take into consideration cohesion and coherence, which give unity to the text. Charolais distinguish 4 meta-rules for achieving and judging coherence. Coherence. U1. Repetition of meaning. Continuity 2. Progression of meaning. Development and direction. 3. An contradiction. Consistency 4. Relevance of meaning. Congruity equals coherence. According to Charolais, the role of cohesion devices is to serve such meta-rules of coherence. In reference to cohesion, Halliday and Hasan distinguish 4 types of cohesive relationships for linking sentences. A. Reference equals CO interpretation. There is a semantic link between the reference item and that which it presupposes: exophora, situational; endophora, textual; anaphora, cataphora, preceding text, following text, comparatives, demonstratives, pronouns, etc. B. Substitution relationship between linguistic items. Replacement of one item by another. Nominal substitution, verbal substitution, clausal substitution. C. Ellipsis equals leaving out sound, morpheme, word, phrase, sentence. D. Lexical cohesion equals selection of vocabulary. Lexical reiteration, repetition of a lexical item following a scale from the same word to the general word. 4. Strategic competence. Lexical collocation, cohesion between a pair of words that have a lexicosemantic relation. This component is made up of mastery of verbal and nonverbal communication strategies that communicators employ to initiate, terminate, maintain, repair, and redirect communication. They may be called into action for 2 main reasons: to compensate for breakdowns in communication due to limiting conditions in actual communication, or to insufficient competence in one or more of the other areas of communicative competence. For example, momentary inability to recall an idea. To enhance the effectiveness of communication. For example, deliberately slow and soft speech for rhetorical effect. Both those situations imply the use of devices like: for grammatical difficulties, the use of reference sources, grammatical and lexical paraphrase, and so on. For social-linguistic difficulties, the use of a single grammatical form for different functions. For example, a declarative sentence can be used as a statement, question, promise. For discourse difficulties, the use of nonverbal symbols. For performance factors, the use of pause fillers like well, Conclusion: the successful acquisition of the foreign language by the student depends on the roles played by him/herself and the teacher. Neither of them can have a passive role in the classroom because they are active participants in the communicative process, both inside and outside. The teacher must encourage the student to express her ideas to the rest of the class and must correct the possible mistakes and compensate her for his poor work, not only by means of a qualification, but also through positive utterances. For their part, students must concentrate on the development of the communicative competence required at their school level. I propose, therefore, an active role for teachers who design their own content and tasks, classroom interaction, materials, methodology, evaluation, etc., instead of a passive role, which means dependence on other people's designs and methods. The expression classroom researcher clearly presents the new role considered above. Then, instead of an uncritical and eclectic way of teaching, teachers should introduce a constant analysis and interpretation of what is happening in the classroom. Certainly, it is the best way of curriculum, teacher, and learner development. After paying attention to innovations in education, the task-based and process models are offered as an alternative. As a conclusion, a relationship is established between curriculum innovation and change and teacher development involving practitioners also taking on the role of researcher. Bibliography. ALLWRIGHT, R. Focus on the Language Classroom. Cambridge, C.U.P. 1981. Austin, J. L. How to Do Things with Words. Oxford, Clarendon Press. 1962. BROUN, G. and YULE, G. Discourse Analysis. Cambridge, C.U.P. 1983. CANDLIN, C.N. The Communicative Teaching of English. Longman, 1981. Harmer, J. The Practice of English Language Teaching. Longman, 1991. Halliday, M.A.K. An Introduction to Functional Grammar. E. Arnold, 1985. Halliday and Hassan. Language, Context and Text. Oxford, O.U.P. 1990. Jacobson, R. Style and Language. Mid Press. Cambridge, Massachusetts, 1960. Larson Freeman, D. Discourse Analysis in Second Language. Newberry House, 1980. Ravel, J. Teaching Techniques for Communicative English. Macmillan, 1995. Widdowson, H. G. Teaching Language as Communication. Oxford, O.U.P. 1985.